What if I told you that one of the most sculptural, expressive, and downright joyful buildings ever constructed in America was designed for one of the most stressful and utilitarian activities humans engage in: air travel? Nestled within the sprawling chaos of John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens, New York, accessible today through a luxury hotel conversion but originally serving as the terminal for Transworld Airlines, stands a building that looks less like conventional architecture and more like a giant bird preparing for flight, or perhaps a massive piece of abstract sculpture that somehow learned to shelter people in airplanes. This is the TWA Flight Center, designed by the Finnish-American architect Eero Saarinen and completed in 1962, just months after his untimely death. A building that represents one of the most audacious and technically sophisticated explorations of reinforced concrete shell construction ever attempted, and a structure that fundamentally reimagined what an airport terminal could be. Not merely a functional processing facility for passengers and luggage, but an architectural expression of the romance, excitement, and futuristic optimism of the jet age. With its soaring concrete vaults that seem to defy gravity, its continuous flowing interior spaces that blur the boundaries between walls, floors, and ceilings, its dramatic use of natural light filtering through carefully shaped openings, and its obsessive attention to every detail from furniture to signage, the TWA Flight Center stands as perhaps the purest example of what architecture historians call organic modernism or expressionist modernism, an approach that rejected the rectilinear glass boxes that dominated mid-century architecture in favor of curving, biomorphic forms that emphasized emotion, movement, and sculptural power. The building is significant not just as a masterpiece of design but as a technical achievement that pushed concrete construction to new limits, as a time capsule that preserves the optimism and glamour of early jet travel before airports became the soul-crushing security theaters we know today, and as a cautionary tale about functional obsolescence. The building closed in 2001 when TWA ceased operations, sat abandoned and threatened with demolition for years, and only survived because preservationists fought to landmark it, and because the hotel developer MCR and architecture firm Bayer Blinder Bell figured out how to adaptively reuse it as a hotel lobby and event space, reopening in 2019 as the TWA Hotel, allowing new generations to experience Saarinen's visionary design. To understand why this building looks the way it does and why it matters so profoundly to architectural history, we need to transport ourselves back to the late 1950s when jet aircraft were revolutionizing air travel, when the future seemed limitless and optimistic, and when one of America's most talented architects was obsessed with creating buildings that expressed the essence of their purpose through sculptural form. The story of the TWA Flight Center begins in 1955 when Transworld Airlines, then one of America's most prominent carriers and known for stylish branding and innovative service, commissioned Eero Saarinen to design a new terminal at what was then called Idlewild Airport, soon to be renamed JFK. This was the golden age of American aviation when flying was glamorous, passengers dressed up for flights, and airlines competed not just on routes and schedules, but on style and experience. And TWA wanted a terminal that would embody the excitement and modernity of jet travel, while also serving as a powerful corporate symbol. Saarinen was the perfect choice for this ambition. Born in Finland in 1910 to the architect Eero Saarinen, Eero had immigrated to America as a teenager when his father was invited to direct the Cranbrook Academy of Art in Michigan, and he'd grown up immersed in design culture, studying sculpture at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière in Paris before earning his architecture degree from Yale. By the late 1950s, Saarinen had established himself as one of America's most innovative architects with buildings like the General Motors Technical Center in Warren, Michigan, which showed his ability to work with corporate clients on large complex projects, and the Milwaukee County War Memorial, which demonstrated his interest in expressive concrete forms. But Saarinen was also struggling with what he saw as the limitations of the international-style glass box that had become the default solution for modern architecture, and he was searching for ways to make buildings more emotionally resonant, more expressive of their specific purposes, and more sculpturally powerful. His design philosophy, which he articulated in various lectures and writings, held that each building should have a strong unifying idea that expressed its purpose and character, and that form should emerge from this idea rather than from preconceived stylistic preferences. For the TWA terminal, Saarinen became obsessed with the concept of flight itself, not literally making the building look like an airplane, which would be kitsch, but capturing the sensation of flight, the graceful curves and movements of birds and aircraft, the sense of uplift and movement, the excitement and optimism of the jet age. The cultural context of the late 1950s and early 1960s is crucial for understanding the TWA Flight Center's exuberant confidence. This was the peak of American post-war prosperity. The space race was capturing public imagination, technology seemed capable of solving any problem, and there was genuine belief that the future would be better, more modern, more efficient, and yes, more beautiful than the past. Saarinen was designing the TWA terminal at the same moment he was working on Dulles International Airport outside Washington, D.C., giving him an almost unprecedented opportunity to reimagine airport architecture at two major facilities simultaneously. Though the two buildings would take very different approaches, Dulles with its suspended roof and mobile lounges, TWA with its sculptural shells and flowing spaces. The design concept that Saarinen developed for TWA is essentially a building conceived as a single sculptural gesture, with four intersecting concrete barrel vaults that rise and fall like wings, creating a structure that reads immediately and powerfully from both exterior and interior. Unlike conventional buildings where structure, enclosure, and space are distinct systems that are then assembled, the TWA Flight Center is essentially a monolithic concrete shell where structure is enclosure is space, a unified three-dimensional form that you experience from inside and outside simultaneously. The roof, which is the building's defining feature, consists of those four vaults arranged in a pinwheel configuration around a central axis, with each vault rising to different heights and curving in different directions, creating a composition that appears organic and dynamic, rather than static and symmetrical. The edges where these vaults meet are kept as thin as structurally possible, sometimes just 6 inches thick, creating the visual illusion that these massive concrete forms are weightless and floating. The exterior is clad in white concrete that Saarinen specified should be kept pristinely white through regular cleaning, enhancing the sculptural quality and the association with clouds and flight, though maintaining that whiteness has been an ongoing preservation challenge. The building's footprint is relatively compact, roughly 200 feet by 300 feet, but the vertical drama of the vaults rising up to 50 feet at their peaks makes it feel much larger and gives it commanding presence despite being dwarfed by the enormous aircraft hangars and later terminal buildings surrounding it. The entries are handled brilliantly. Rather than a conventional door in a wall, you enter through curving openings between the vaults that feel more like passing through a membrane or being drawn into the building's interior. And this threshold experience immediately signals that you're entering something special, rather than just another airport terminal. Once inside, visitors encounter what is arguably one of the most spectacular interior spaces created in 20th century American architecture. A flowing, continuous volume where walls curve seamlessly into ceilings, where multiple levels are connected by broad curving stairs and balconies that seem to float within the space, where natural light pours in from carefully positioned skylights and clear-story windows that follow the curves of the vaults, and where every surface, every detail, every piece of furniture reinforces the organic flowing character of the architecture. The main terminal hall, which served as the ticketing and waiting area, exploits the full vertical drama of the intersecting vaults, with the soaring concrete shells visible overhead and the space organized around a central sunken lounge area that Saarinen conceived as a place where passengers could relax and watch the activity of the terminal unfold around them. The spatial experience is fundamentally cinematic. There's no single static viewpoint from which the space makes complete sense, but rather it reveals itself through movement, with new vistas and perspectives constantly emerging as you walk through it. And this dynamic quality perfectly expressed the idea of travel and movement that was central to Saarinen's concept. The circulation strategy was revolutionary for its time. Passengers would enter at the landside, proceed through the dramatic main hall for ticketing, then descend via those floating staircases to a lower level where they'd walk through enclosed tubes directly to their aircraft parked at the gates, allowing them to move from car to plane while always remaining within Saarinen's designed environment. This meant that unlike conventional terminals where passengers transition from architecture to industrial infrastructure, TWA passengers were cocooned in architectural experience throughout their journey, with even the jetway tubes designed as sculptural elements with windows shaped like airplane windows. The material palette is surprisingly restrained given the building's sculptural exuberance, primarily white concrete for the shells, red carpeting that provided warm color contrast and absorbed sound, black and white tile patterns in some areas, warm wood paneling in the lounges, and carefully designed furniture throughout including Saarinen's own iconic tulip chairs, which look perfect in this environment. because they share the building's organic sculptural language. The technical achievement of the TWA Flight Center cannot be overstated. This is one of the most structurally audacious buildings of the 20th century, requiring innovations in both design methodology and construction technique that push the boundaries of what was possible with reinforced concrete. The structural system is a thin-shell concrete construction, a type of structure that achieves strength through its three-dimensional curved geometry rather than through mass or depth, similar to how an eggshell is remarkably strong despite being very thin because of its curved form. This structural approach had been pioneered by engineers like Pierluigi Nervi in Italy and Felix Candela in Mexico, but the TWA Flight Center represented one of the most complex applications of thin-shell design ever attempted, with its multiple intersecting vaults creating geometric and structural challenges that required sophisticated analysis. Saarinen worked closely with the engineering firm Ammon & Whitney, and particularly with the engineer Abator, to develop the structural system, and this was truly collaborative work where engineering and architecture were inseparable. The building's sculptural form is its structure, and any change to the curves or the shell thickness would have altered both structural performance and architectural character. The design process involved extensive physical modeling because the mathematical analysis of such complex curved surfaces was extremely difficult in the pre-computer era. So the team built numerous plaster models at different scales to study the forms, understand the load paths, and refine the geometry. The shells vary in thickness from just 6 inches at the edges to about 36 inches at the base where they meet the ground and where forces are concentrated, and this carefully calibrated variation in thickness allowed the structure to be as thin and light as possible while still handling the load safely. The concrete itself had to be carefully specified to achieve the strength needed, while allowing the intricate formwork to be filled completely, and the mix included smaller aggregate than typical structural concrete to ensure it would flow into all areas of the complex forms. The construction process was incredibly challenging. The formwork required to create these curved shells was essentially a temporary wooden sculpture that had to be built with extreme precision, and contractors had to essentially learn new techniques because there was no precedent for building something quite like this. The pouring of the concrete had to be carefully sequenced to avoid cracking or distortion as different sections cured, and the shore supporting the formwork couldn't be removed until the entire shell had cured sufficiently to carry its own weight as a unified structure. The building took about 3 years to construct, longer than typical terminals, and cost overruns were significant, but TWA supported Saarinen's vision and understood they were getting something extraordinary. The integration of natural light is one of the building's most successful features. Saarinen carefully positioned openings where the curved vaults meet, creating clear-story windows that bring daylight deep into the interior while avoiding glare and maintaining the sculptural drama of the shells. There are also strategically placed skylights shaped to follow the building's curves, and a dramatic window wall at the flight side elevation that gives views out to the airfield and brings in even more light, while creating a powerful visual connection between the terminal's interior and the aircraft outside. The artificial lighting was also carefully designed with fixtures integrated into the architecture, rather than applied as afterthoughts, continuing Saarinen's total design approach. The mechanical systems required clever integration because Saarinen refused to let ductwork and equipment compromise the purity of his spaces. Air handling equipment was located in a separate building connected underground, with supply and return air distributed through the floor and through carefully hidden grills, and even details like sprinkler heads were custom designed to minimize their visual impact. The acoustic performance of the space, with its hard concrete surfaces and soaring volume, could have been disastrous, but the red carpeting and strategic use of sound-absorbing materials in seating areas helped control reverberation, and the space was actually praised for being more pleasant acoustically than many conventional terminals despite its size and hardness. The attention to detail extended to everything passengers would see and touch. Saarinen's office designed custom furniture, custom signage with a distinctive font and graphic system, custom light fixtures, even the departure boards and ticket counters, all reinforcing the unified design vision, and all sharing the organic curving vocabulary of the architecture. This level of control, sometimes called total design, was characteristic of Saarinen's approach and was more common in European design practice than American, and it's a big part of why the TWA Flight Center feels so coherent and complete as an experience. When the TWA Flight Center opened in May 1962, the reception was rapturous. Architecture critics hailed it as a masterpiece, the public loved it, and it immediately became one of New York's most celebrated new buildings despite being located at an airport rather than in Manhattan. Ada Louise Huxtable, the architecture critic who would become so important to the discourse around preservation, called it a work of architecture that rises to the level of genuine art. And most critics agreed that Saarinen had created something genuinely new and emotionally powerful. The building won numerous awards, including the AIA New York Chapter Medal of Honor, and it was featured in countless magazines, films, and advertisements, becoming an icon of jet-age modernity and American technological optimism. The influence on airport design was actually more limited than you might expect. The TWA terminal was so specific to its time and place, so sculptural and expensive, that it didn't spawn direct imitators the way Saarinen's Dulles terminal influenced subsequent airport architecture with its mobile lounge concept. But it did demonstrate that airport terminals could be architecturally significant rather than merely utilitarian, and it raised the bar for what clients and the public expected from airport design, even if subsequent terminals mostly pursued very different architectural strategies. The broader influence on modernist architecture was more substantial. The TWA Flight Center, along with buildings like Jornetson's Sydney Opera House and Le Corbusier's Ronchamp Chapel, demonstrated that modernism could be expressive and sculptural rather than just rational and rectilinear, expanding the formal vocabulary available to modern architects and legitimizing a more organic, plastic approach to form-making. Sadly, Eero Saarinen didn't live to see his masterpiece completed. He died suddenly in September 1961 from a brain tumor during surgery, just 51 years old and at the height of his creative powers, leaving the TWA Flight Center to be completed by his associates including Kevin Roche and John Dinkeloo, who would go on to form their own distinguished practice. The building functioned as intended for about 4 decades, but changes in the airline industry, the growth in aircraft size, increased security requirements after September 11th, and finally TWA's bankruptcy and dissolution in 2001 rendered the terminal functionally obsolete. It was too small for modern wide-body aircraft, its open-flowing spaces were incompatible with Post 9/11 security protocols, and its designation as a New York City landmark in 1994 meant it couldn't be easily modified or demolished. For years it sat empty and decaying, with broken windows and water damage threatening the structure, and despite its landmark status there were real questions about whether it could be saved and what adaptive reuse could possibly work for such a specialized building. The solution that eventually emerged was brilliant in its simplicity: convert the terminal into a hotel lobby, restaurant, and event space, add new hotel room wings designed sympathetically but clearly contemporary, and connect the entire complex to JetBlue's Terminal 5 so hotel guests can actually watch aircraft operations while surrounded by Saarinen's architecture. The TWA Hotel, which opened in 2019 after a painstaking restoration and adaptive reuse project, has been remarkably successful both economically and in reintroducing the building to new generations who never experienced it as a functioning terminal. The restoration team, led by Bayer Blinder Bell architects working with preservation consultants and engineers, had to address decades of deferred maintenance, repair concrete that had been damaged by water infiltration and freeze-thaw cycles, restore the interior finishes and furniture, and recreate lighting and details based on historic photographs and remaining fragments. The hotel addition includes 2 new buildings flanking Saarinen's terminal that house the actual guest rooms, designed with mid-century modern detailing that references the 1960s without attempting to imitate Saarinen's inimitable forms, and these additions are carefully positioned so they don't compete visually with the historic terminal when viewed from the airport approach. The TWA Flight Center today operates as something like a museum you can inhabit, where people come not just to stay in a hotel but to experience one of architecture's great spaces, to understand what airports used to be before they became places we endure rather than enjoy, and to witness the optimism and craft of an era that believed design mattered, and that ordinary buildings serving ordinary functions deserved extraordinary architecture. Standing in that soaring main hall today, looking up at those concrete vaults that seem to float overhead, watching the light filter through the clear-story windows, sitting in an original tulip chair surrounded by the red carpeting and the flowing curves, you understand viscerally what Eero Saarinen was after. A building that makes you feel the excitement of flight, that lifts your spirits through spatial drama and sculptural beauty, that demonstrates architecture's power to transform mundane activities into memorable experiences. The TWA Flight Center reminds us that modernism at its best wasn't cold or inhuman, but could be joyful, expressive, and emotionally resonant, that technical virtuosity and artistic vision can work together rather than in opposition, and that the best buildings are those where every decision from the largest structural strategy to the smallest detail reinforces a clear, powerful idea. For architects and architecture students, the TWA Flight Center offers endless lessons about the relationship between form and structure, about the importance of spatial sequence and choreographed experience, about material expression, about total design thinking, about how to create buildings that are both functionally specific and culturally resonant, and perhaps most importantly, about having the courage to pursue a radical vision, even when conventional solutions would be easier and cheaper. The building also stands as a reminder that great architecture requires great clients willing to take risks and invest in quality, and that preservation battles are worth fighting because once these masterpieces are lost, they can never be recreated, and that adaptive reuse, when done thoughtfully, can give historic buildings new life while allowing contemporary audiences to experience them. If exploring one of the 20th century's most sculptural and expressive buildings has made you want to book a room at the TWA Hotel just to spend a night surrounded by Saarinen's vision, or if you're inspired to think differently about how architecture can capture emotion and movement in built form, consider subscribing to UrbArchitect for more deep dives into the buildings that prove architecture can be both technically brilliant and deeply moving. Because understanding these masterworks helps us recognize quality when we encounter it and demand better from our own built environment.